1945, the Pentagon, nerve center of the nation's defense. With the war over, the Army Air Forces looked to the future as their commanding general, Hap Arnold, drew a lesson from Allied victories all over the world.
We must be sure that none of these victories is wasted and thrown away in the years to come. There will no longer be any spot on Earth, and certainly not in America, that is safe from attack by air. For our protection, we must have an Air Force second to none. For this, we need a great aviation industry, a great air transport system, and a great body of trained personnel. But we'll need more than planes, pilots, mechanics. We'll need scientists and mathematicians, and we'll need the full inventive genius of the American people. With these, we can protect the future, ourselves and our allies, with the weapons of the future.
Constant research and development gave America these weapons. We in the Pentagon had a new mission, not to prepare for war, but to prevent war. After Arnold retired, Carl Spaatz became commanding general of the AAF, and in 1947 sparked plug creation of the separate Air Force and saw it come into being. The next year, Hoyt Vandenberg became Chief of Staff. Appointed Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations was Loris Norstad. In carrying out the Unification Act, the Army, Navy, and Air Force were being integrated into a powerful fighting machine to combat the growing Cold War.
June 1948, Berlin, where the Cold War was becoming warm. In the German capital city, which had suffered destruction, famine, and chaos, the Allied military governments had restored order. Guilty of war, 2.5 million Berliners now lived in a divided city, but they lived in peace. Feeding Berlin, isolated by the surrounding Soviet zone, was a system of rails, roads, canals, and air corridors, which connected the city with the western zones. When the Soviets announced traffic restrictions, an aggravated phase of the Cold War began. This was an attempt to force the Western Allies to surrender their position in Berlin, and the weapon was hunger. For that purpose, the communists ordered the trains to Berlin stopped. Claiming technical difficulties, they closed the land and water routes between Berlin and the western zones. This suspension of all traffic successfully blockaded the city. Dead trains and walls of words were making pawns of the Americans, French and British, as well as the Germans, in the terrible game of hunger which had curtailed food shipments through the Soviet-occupied area. With all arteries closed, Berlin was paralyzed. As 75% of the lights went out, the Allies made an important decision: not to retreat from Berlin.
On 26 June 1948, General Curtis LeMay started the airlift, and the U.S. Air Force began writing another page in the history of freedom's struggle against tyranny. From western fields like Rhine, Maine, we flew the air corridors to the Soviet zone, to Tempelhof in Berlin. Our job was to save a city from starvation. The airlift was the nation's first important peacetime use of air power as an instrument of national policy, according to America's Air Force leaders, Secretary Stuart Symington and General Hoyt Vandenberg. Together with General Lucius Clay, head of the European Command, we accepted the challenge and sent out the call for troop carriers and military air transports around the world. MAT squadrons from the Caribbean to Guam in 2 weeks sent us 237 aircraft. In the States, Westover was our jumping-off point for airlift planes preparing to span the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the RAF was hard at work flying in Dakotas and Yorks to fields in the British zone. The Combined Airlift Task Force, with headquarters at Wiesbaden, Germany, was the driving force that kept us going. Headed up by General William Tunner, veteran commander of the historic operation which flew the hump in Asia, the task force sparked the military and civilian services that poured supplies into Berlin and brought out manufactured goods.
The Navy played a vital part. In this classic example of unification, Army, Navy, and Air Force together tackled the blockade. Rhine, Maine became the chief gateway for Berlin. Here, the Army Transportation Corps moved freight in large 10-ton trailers, roughly corresponding to the cargo carrying capacity of a C-54. To feed Berlin, a city bigger than Philadelphia, meant loading airplanes with coal from the Ruhr and foodstuffs from all over the world. To think of supplying the necessities of life to an entire city by air was a daring concept. But in so doing, the airlift was to become a symbol of Western strength and determination. Not a gun was being fired in this fight to maintain a city. Yet United States air power, aided by all the services, was helping the military establishment to support our foreign policy and chalk up decisive gains in the struggle for peace.
Back in 1918, we flew mail. In 32, we flew food. Later, we helped in floods and disasters. In the big war, we flew everything from bulldozers to atom bombs. But never did we fly like this. Some of us had bombed Berlin. Now we were trying to keep the same city alive. Experts figured the 2.5 million blockaded citizens required 4,500 tons of food and supplies every day. This target meant we had to get more from each plane and each crew than ever before. Takeoffs with full loads were spaced 3 minutes apart until the sky bridge became thick with planes. In the narrow air corridor, 40 to 50 planes were stacked in 5 levels, 500 feet apart. Precise air traffic control was vital to full-scale operations. Here, the positions of each plane in the chain of flight was recorded. November was the month when everyone working on Operation Vittles was put to the supreme test. Rain, heavy fog, and socked-in airfields were the rule. The communists expected weather to break the airlift. They didn't know what American teamwork could do. Without Army Airways communication system operating the network over which was transmitted all information that GCA required, German weather would have stopped us. But in fog or night, our planes were like kites on a string. Rotating GCA antennas tied air and ground together. GCA operators talked us down at the rate of a plane every 3 minutes.
Baker George 2, this is the final controller. Remain on receive for the remainder of this transmission. Maintain your present elevation and continue vector 315. You're almost at the glide path. Begin your rate of descent at 500 feet per minute. We're starting down the glide path. Rate of descent is good. Azimuth is good. Elevation good. Very nice flying indeed. Maintain your heading. On course, on the glide path. Very good. Now over the end of the runway. Azimuth and elevation both perfect. Touchdown in 4 seconds. Take it over, Baker George 2. It's all yours from here.
Tempelhof GCA made 2,295 such landings in 1 month. When the weather cleared, we broke our own records, racking up more flights and more tonnage until the Berlin food ration was actually increased while the airlift was still in operation. To supply the city, we had to fly 3 round trips a day. At the end of the line, volunteer crews of displaced persons were always on duty. It took an army to unload our planes. In a single month, Tempelhof handled almost 14,000 takeoffs and landings. Around the clock, 7 days a week, our skymasters rolled on Tempelhof's curving apron to the waiting trucks. Biggest item was coal, packed in war surplus duffel bags for power, heat, and light. Breaking the records as fast as we made them, the eyes of the Western world watched the airlift. Also watching were the eyes in the Soviet zone. I remember April 16th, the 249th day of the blockade, when we in the LeMay Coal and Feed Company, together with the RAF, flew in almost 13,000 tons. That was more than Berlin got before the blockade.
This was Berlin. It could have been Waco, St. Louis, Akron, or your hometown. Berlin was saved because the Air Force had delivered the stuff where and when it could do the most good. Yesterday, it was bombs to compel peace. Today, in the bitter struggle to prevent man-imposed famine, it was bread to maintain peace. Airlift cargoes had kept the city alive. Before Operation Vittles, Berlin was one of the places where children cringed in terror at the roar of a plane overhead. They remembered one use man had made of air power. Operation Vittles taught these kids to cringe no more. The airlift proved again General Eisenhower's belief that air power, the only agent whose effectiveness is not restricted by geographic and man-made barriers or reduced by long delay between decision to act and action itself, is a dominant agent in modern warfare. During 462 days of blockade, 276,000 flights transported 2.25 million tons of life-sustaining necessities. America can well be proud of this unified and combined effort, which stands as the greatest transportation feat in the history of the world, accomplished by the RAF, the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force.